Los Angeles, the early morning hours of November 21st, 1980. A phone rings inside a house belonging to one of the most famous musicians in America. Paramedics are being summoned. When they arrive, they find a 16-year-old girl naked in the middle of what appears to be a seizure, having overdosed on a dangerous mix of quaaludes and cocaine. By the time the ambulance reaches her, she is stabilized enough to answer questions. And one of those answers changes everything. She is 16 years old. Police from the Los Angeles Police Department's Sexually Exploited Child Unit are dispatched to the scene. The owner of the house is arrested. His name is Don Henley, drummer, co-founder, and one of the defining voices of the Eagles, the band that just shattered nearly every commercial record in the history of American rock music with Hotel California. This is not the image most people carry of Don Henley. Most people think of the desert highways of Take It Easy, the lush harmonies of Desperado, the eerie, hypnotic menace of Hotel California, a song so iconic it remains one of the most analyzed pieces of music in rock history. They think of a brooding, intelligent songwriter, an environmental activist, an outspoken critic of the music industry's greed. They don't think about a 16-year-old girl in his bathroom at 4 a.m. So what really happened to Don Henley? How did a kid from a tiny town in northeast Texas, a kid who once played trombone in his high school marching band because his football coach said he was too small for team, end up co-writing one of the most celebrated rock catalogs of the 20th century, and also end up in one of the most uncomfortable, complicated scandals of his era? This is a full story. The triumphant parts and the deeply troubling ones. Both belong to the truth. Donald Hugh Henley was born on July 22, 1947, in Gilmer, Texas, and grew up in the small, sleepy town of Linden, in the far northeastern corner of the state. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the nearest big city feels like a different planet entirely. He attended Linden Kildare High School, where his first instinct, like so many small-town Texas boys, was football. But his coach took one look at his slight build and gently suggested he try something else. So Don joined the school band instead. He started on trombone before eventually moving to the percussion section, the instrument that would end up defining the rest of his life. While he was still in high school, his childhood friend Richard Bowden invited him into a Dixieland group his father had put together. That early band would go through name change after name change, the Four Speeds, then Felicity, before finally settling, after a fateful introduction to fellow Texan country star Kenny Rogers, on the name Shiloh. But before any of that could fully take shape, life intervened in the way it often does, brutally and without warning. Don enrolled at Stephen F. Austin State University, then transferred to North Texas State University, where he studied English literature. And then, partway through his college years, he made a decision that would say everything about the kind of son he was. He left school entirely to go home and care for his father, who was dying slowly of heart and arterial disease. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. Long before Hotel California made him a household name, long before the private jets and platinum records, Don Henley was a young man who walked away from his education to sit at his father's bedside in a small Texas town, watching him decline. C.J. Henley would die in 1972, just as his son's career was beginning to take its first real flight in Los Angeles. Don never got to see, in front of his father's own eyes, the scale of what he would eventually become. If this story is resonating with you already, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like this reach more people. While he was caring for his father back in Linden, Henley kept playing with Shiloh on the side, and in 1968, fate intervened in the form of Kenny Rogers, who caught one of their shows and was impressed enough to encourage the band to take their shot in Los Angeles. In June of 1970, Shiloh made the move, recording a self-titled album produced by Rogers himself, while the band members lived together at his house. It didn't lead to lasting success. The band dissolved within a year over internal disagreements about leadership and creative direction. For most musicians, this is the moment a dream quietly dies. A band moves to L.A. with big hopes, records one album, and fades into obscurity. But for Don Henley, it was simply the door that led to the next one. In Los Angeles, he crossed paths with guitarists from Royal Oak, Michigan, named Glenn Frey, who had also recently relocated to chase the same dream. The two were both signed to the same small label. And in 1971, they found themselves recruited into a backing band for one of the rising stars of the era, Linda Ronstadt. It was on that tour, night after night playing behind Ronstadt, that Henley and Fry began talking about forming something of their own. Joined by bassist Randy Meisner and guitarist Bernie Leadon, also veterans of Ronstadt's touring band, the four men formed a new group. They called themselves the Eagles. What followed over the next decade would become one of the most extraordinary success stories in the history of American popular music. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because the rise of the Eagles and what it cost the men inside it is a story that deserves to be told in full. Signed to David Geffen's Asylum Records, the Eagles released their self-titled debut album in 1972, led by the breezy, instantly classic single, Take It Easy. From there, the hits arrived in a steady, relentless stream: Witchy Woman, Desperado, Best of My Love, One of These Nights. Don Henley, originally hired primarily as a drummer, gradually emerged as one of the band's defining vocal and songwriting forces, alongside Fry. Together, the two men became what Henley himself would later describe, with characteristic bluntness, in a 2001 interview on Charlie Rose, as a kind of benevolent dictatorship within the band. The two primary songwriters, he said, were always going to be the ones who held the real power. Then in 1976 came the album that would change everything, Hotel California. The title track alone, co-written by Henley, Fry, and guitarist Don Felder, became one of the most scrutinized, debated, and endlessly reinterpreted songs in the history of rock music, a sprawling, atmospheric meditation on excess, illusion, and the impossibility of escaping the trappings of fame and success once you fully entered that world. It is almost impossible to overstate how massive the Eagles became. They remain, to this day, among the top-selling bands in American history, with their greatest hits compilation standing as one of the best-selling albums ever released in the United States. By any commercial measure, by the end of the 1970s, the Eagles were not just successful, they were practically a cultural institution. But behind the soaring harmonies and the sun-drenched California imagery of their music, the band was quietly disintegrating. The making of their sixth studio album, The Long Run, released in 1979, was, by nearly every account from people who were there, a grueling, miserable process. Years of constant touring, mounting interpersonal tension, substance abuse, and creative exhaustion had worn the band down to its breaking point. The record took far longer to make than anyone anticipated, and the relationships between its members frayed under the pressure. In 1980, following a particularly difficult tour, the Eagles broke up, not with a clean, dignified farewell, but with the kind of bitter, exhausted finality that comes after years of friction finally boiling over completely. And it was in the immediate aftermath of that breakup, in the fog of depression, isolation, and a band identity that had defined nearly his entire adult life suddenly evaporating, that Don Henley made a decision that would lead directly to the most disturbing chapter of his public life. According to his own later courtroom testimony, given decades afterward during an unrelated legal dispute over the ownership of handwritten Eagles lyric sheets, Henley described his state of mind on the night of November 20th, 1980, with unusual candor. He said he was depressed and alone following the band's collapse, and that he specifically did not want to see any of his friends that night. Instead, he placed a call to a madam and arranged for a sex worker to come to his Los Angeles home. What he has maintained consistently, in interviews and in his own contemporaneous letter to his probation officer, is that he did not know the woman who arrived at his door was 16 years old. According to that letter, the two had drinks together and used cocaine. At some point during the night, the girl appeared to Henley to be having what looked like an epileptic seizure. Frightened, he called paramedics. By the time emergency responders arrived, the girl had regained consciousness. It was only when paramedics began asking her routine questions that her real age came to light. Officers from the LAPD's Sexually Exploited Child Unit were then called to the scene, and Henley was placed under arrest alongside the girl herself, who was arrested for prostitution. A second girl found inside the house, only 15 years old, was also arrested for being under the influence of drugs. This was not, according to court records that would surface decades later, the first time Henley had been found in the company of an underage sex worker. This is a deeply uncomfortable part of Don Henley's story, and it deserves to be treated with the seriousness it demands, not minimized and not sensationalized either. Henley was ultimately charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He pleaded no contest. He was fined $2,500 and placed on 2 years probation, a remarkably light legal consequence given the severity of what had occurred in that house. For decades, Henley's public explanations centered on his claim that he never asked the girl her age, that she appeared to him to be somewhere between 19 and 21 years old, and that he had not engaged in sexual contact with her once he learned the truth. But more than 40 years later, in 2024, during a completely unrelated criminal trial in New York concerning the alleged theft and sale of original handwritten Eagles lyric manuscripts, this old case resurfaced in startling detail. Defense attorneys for 2 of the men accused in that theft case sought to introduce a letter Henley had written to his Santa Monica probation officer back in the early 1980s, describing his own account of that night in far more detail than he had ever offered publicly. That letter contradicted parts of the narrative Henley had maintained for decades. He had long claimed the gathering that night was a farewell party for the Eagles row crew. The letter told a different story entirely, that he had specifically wanted to be alone, away from his friends, and had called to madam himself out of isolation and depression. The letter also stated that he and the girl had attempted to make love after he had supplied her with cocaine and Quaaludes, a detail that stood in tension with his repeated public insistence that no sexual contact occurred. When questioned directly about it under oath during that 2024 trial, Henley was asked by the opposing attorney whether he had asked the girl her age when she arrived. He said he had not. "It never occurred to me that she was underage," he testified. "I don't ask for ID when they come to my house." The attorney pressed further, asking whether sex workers visited his home often. Henley did not deny it. He was also asked directly about his cocaine use during that era of his life. "Sex, drugs, and rock and roll is not regulatory," he said. "We used cocaine throughout the 70s. I was always lucid when doing business. If I was some kind of a drug-fueled zombie, I couldn't have accomplished everything I'd accomplish." It is a genuinely jarring thing to witness. A man in his late 70s, testifying under oath in a courtroom, casually characterizing the worst night of someone else's adolescence as simply part of the culture of the era he came from. What do you make of an artist whose worst moment becomes inseparable from the legend built around him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of the more complicated questions in the history of classic rock. In the years that followed his arrest, Don Henley did something that, depending entirely on how you view it, was either a remarkable act of artistic transformation or an unsettling act of turning personal scandal directly into commercial profit. He used the public fallout from the incident as direct creative inspiration for Dirty Laundry, a biting, cynical song released in 1982 that skewered the sensationalism and hypocrisy of tabloid media culture. The song became Henley's biggest solo hit, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and earning a gold certification for selling over 1 million copies. There is something undeniably uncomfortable in that sequence of events. An artist whose own arrest involved a minor profiting commercially, years later, from a song explicitly about media exploitation of personal scandal. Henley has never publicly grappled with that particular irony in any meaningful way. What he has said repeatedly across decades of interviews and most recently under oath in that 2024 trial is some version of the same sentiment. That was a poor decision which I regret to this day, and that he sought what he called an escape from the crushing depression he felt after the collapse of the band that had defined his entire adult identity up to that point. Lois Childs, the actress Henley had previously dated and who was no longer romantically involved with him at the time of the incident, later offered her own characterization of events to the press. "I was shocked to hear about it. He didn't have drugs around the house. It was an accident, I'm sure." Whether one finds that characterization convincing is, ultimately, left to each listener to decide for themselves. But Don Henley's story did not end in that bathroom in November 1980, and the rest of his career trajectory tells a far more complicated, far more layered story about how an industry and a public choose to remember men who define an era of its music. His solo career, launched almost immediately after the Eagles' breakup, became enormously successful in its own right. I Can't Stand Still in 1982, Building the Perfect Beast in 1984, which produced The Boys of Summer, a song that would go on to win multiple MTV Video Music Awards, including Video of the Year. The End of the Innocents in 1989, a record widely regarded as one of the finest solo rock albums of its decade. Henley also became, somewhat improbably, one of the music industry's most outspoken and persistent advocates for artists' rights. He took on major record labels over royalty disputes. He testified before the California State Senate on contractual fairness for musicians. In 2002, he became head of the Recording Artists Coalition. He fought and won a legal battle to prevent Geffen Records from blocking him from working with other labels, even suing the label's founder, David Geffen himself, for what Henley alleged was an attempt to have him quietly blackballed across the entire industry. He also became a committed environmental activist, founding the Walden Woods Project specifically to protect the land surrounding Massachusetts' Walden Pond, the same landscape that inspired the writings of Henry David Thoreau, from commercial development. In 1994, the Eagles reunited for what became known as the Hell Freezes over tour, a wry acknowledgement of Henley's own earlier, much-quoted remark that the band would reunite only when hell froze over. The tour and the accompanying live album were massively successful, reigniting the band's commercial dominance for an entirely new generation of fans who had grown up on their music secondhand. In 1995, Henley married model and socialite Sharon Summerall in a wedding that featured performances from an almost unbelievable roster of musical legends: Bruce Springsteen, Sting, Billy Joel, John Fogerty, Jackson Browne, Sheryl Crow, and his own bandmate Glenn Frey. Together, Henley and Summerall raised 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Summerall would later be diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and Henley wrote a tender song for her, "Everything is Different Now," on his 2000 solo album Inside Job. In 2016, tragedy struck the Eagles once again, this time with finality that left no room for reunion tours or comeback albums. Glenn Frey, Henley's longtime creative partner and the other half of the songwriting engine that had powered the band's entire history, died from complications related to rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, and pneumonia. At the Grammy Awards that same year, the surviving members of the Eagles, alongside Jackson Browne, performed "Take It Easy" as a tribute to Frey, the song that had launched their entire career together more than 4 decades earlier. With Frey's passing, Don Henley became the band's sole remaining consistent founding member, the last man standing from that original lineup assembled in the back of Linda Ronstadt's touring band so many decades before. By 2012, financial analysts estimated Henley's net worth at approximately $200 million, placing him among the wealthiest drummers in the world, behind only Ringo Starr, Phil Collins, and Dave Grohl. He had received 2 Grammy Awards, the prestigious Music Cares Person of the Year honor, and in 2008, Rolling Stone ranked him as the 87th greatest singer in the history of recorded music. So, what really happened to Don Henley? The honest answer is that several very different things happened simultaneously to the same man, and none of them cancel the others out. A boy from a tiny town in northeast Texas, too small for football, found his calling in a high school band, and through a combination of genuine talent, relentless work, and a fair amount of luck, helped build one of the most commercially successful and critically respected rock bands of all time. He sat beside his dying father instead of finishing his college degree, and built a legendary career anyway. He co-wrote songs that remain etched into the cultural memory of an entire country, songs still played on radio stations every single day, more than 50 years after he first picked up a set of drumsticks. And in the wreckage of his band's collapse, in a moment of genuine personal crisis, that same man made a decision that ended with a 16-year-old girl overdosing in his bathroom. A decision whose full details he obscured and reshaped for more than 4 decades, only to have a far more complicated truth surface, almost by accident, in an unrelated courtroom dispute over the ownership of old, yellowed legal pads filled with handwritten song lyrics. He turned that scandal into one of his biggest commercial hits. He spent the following decades fighting genuinely admirable battles for musicians' rights and environmental conservation. He built a stable, long-lasting marriage and raised a family. And he has never, in any interview, in any courtroom, in any public statement across more than 40 years, fully reckoned with what that night actually meant for the girl who was in that house, the one whose name almost nobody remembers, and whose life afterward almost nobody has bothered to ask about. That asymmetry between how thoroughly we remember the architect of Hotel California and how completely we have forgotten the 16-year-old girl found unconscious in his bathroom might be the most uncomfortable truth buried inside this entire story. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you for sticking with a story that doesn't offer an easy, comfortable conclusion. Some legends deserve unqualified celebration. Don Henley's story isn't one of those, and pretending otherwise wouldn't do justice to anyone involved. Hit that like button if this gave you a more complete picture of an artist most of us only ever encountered through his music. And tell us in the comments, does an artist's personal conduct change the way you experience their music? Or can the two be separated entirely? It's a question that comes up again and again in stories like this one, and there's no single right answer. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we'll keep telling these complicated, fully human stories about the legends behind the music, the full truth, not just a highlight reel. Don Henley once sang about an inn you can check into but never truly leave. Maybe the same is true of the past itself. Some rooms in the hotel of a person's history never really get checked out of. They just wait there quietly until someone finally walks back down that hallway and opens a door.